What I'd like to do is quickly introduce, as you can see on the screen, our panel for this afternoon. And today's discussion really is a conversation with the panelists and with you about where we have been as a federal financial community since the passage of the CFO Act, it's now more than 30 years ago. There has been significant changes over those 30 years. And what we want to talk a little bit about is the accomplishments that we've had over that period of time. And as importantly, really think about the future. And certainly the future has changed dramatically for all of us over the last year with the pandemic. But I also think that the pandemic has opened up our eyes as to what the future could look like even better than what we had envisioned only a year ago. So with that, I'd like to introduce our four panelists. And I think most of these folks are no strangers to AGA. Phyllis Anderson with the Government Accountability Office, Tim Gribben with the Treasury Department, Lynn Muaney with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and Zach Lewis with the Office of Senator Mark Warner. What we're going to do this afternoon is ask each of our panelists to take 5 to 7 to 10 minutes talking a little bit about their involvement with the CFO community. And then we're going to launch into a series of questions. And I really would encourage you all to participate in the conversation through the question function. We do have a series of prepared questions that we'll get started with, but I know that this audience is not hesitant to engage with the panel. So what I'd like to do is ask Phyllis to start the conversation. Phyllis?
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. Can you hear me?
Yes, next, okay, good. Go ahead, Phyllis, sorry.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here to discuss the GAO study on the Chief Financial Officers Act of 1990. I'll briefly discuss some of the results of our study, which we did from 2018 to 2020, and we looked at the full 30 years of what has been going on since the CFO Act. I do want to state a little disclaimer here that the views I will be discussing are my own. The facts will come from the GAO report. So we started the study back in 2018. We had a survey of all the CFOs, deputy CFOs, acting CFOs, acting inspector generals. We did expert discussion groups. We met with clients on the Hill. We met with auditors who do audits of federal accounting agencies. We met with the Federal Accounting Standards Advisory Board. We met with prior controller generals. We actually met with the person who actually was key in developing the CFO Act, and that was Chuck Bowser, the former controller general. So we really tried to leave no stone unturned with regard to the study of the CFO Act. And at the end of the day, where we came out was we found that there had been a substantial amount of progress over the 30 years. And of course, there's some refinements that have that are needed. But overall, I think one of the telling results is the fact that most of us are working from home and the technology is still working and all the paychecks and the audits were conducted. So there's been vast amount of progress. The CFO Act was beginning legislation, but there was certainly other parts of legislation that helped embellish what the CFO Act was designed to do. And when you start looking back at it, we looked at it from even before World War II, if you will, where during that time, things were heavily decentralized. So we went and saw how things had actually come forward and the reasons for it and why the CFO Act was so pivotal. We met with members of the CFO Council. We met with inspector generals as well. And overwhelming, it is a very good story. OMB created decentralized leadership structures. They put certain things into action that still remain. And you had a lot of coordination in the federal government throughout that 30 years. So overwhelming, the message is one of great success. During that time, you have the Federal Accounting Standards Advisory Board create accounting standards geared to the federal government, recognized by the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. You had agencies having clean opinions. For example, one of the first audits required by the CFO Act, that was 1996, there were 6 clean audit opinions. Now there's 22 of the 24 agencies generally have those kind of clean opinions, which is phenomenal. At present, there are some trends occurring. Certainly, there's opportunities, there's challenges with regard to some of the financial management systems. There's still certain agencies that have legacy systems still in place, outdated technology. There have been a lot of efforts to establish technology modernization plans. But with technology advances, as they continue rapidly, and we can all attest to 30 years ago, there was no internet. We didn't have smartphones. So technology is rapidly advancing. I think the challenge is to what extent the federal government will be able to take into consideration and use more of those different technologies like artificial intelligence, robotics, and to the extent there will be a comprehensive strategy for shared services. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities for even with the federal management workforce, certainly with the millennials and other people coming into the federal government, there are opportunities because the type of work that used to be done, they have a different appetite for a different type of work. And there's new technologies that they're very close to. For the future, looking for the future, we think there is opportunities for further collaboration. Since the CFO Act, there's been quite a few different councils, like the Inspector General, like the Chief Acquisition Officers Council. The CFO Council was created by the CFO Act, the Chief Information Officer. So there's quite a few councils. And with all these different councils, there seems to be a need for further collaboration. We also discussed standardization of CFO roles across agencies, as well as shaping and training and developing the future federal workforce. Those are my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Phyllis. And Megan, could you please move to the next slide? Tim, you've had an opportunity to be a customer of the fiscal organization at Treasury, and now you lead the Bureau. Can you talk a little bit about sort of your experiences and your sort of view of the future, where we're going, what some of the challenges are, and then we're going to talk during the Q&A about some of those more detailed recommendations.
Sure, thank you. So, as we all know, across the federal sector, there's thousands of employees that work in financial management through hundreds of agencies. And how do you bring that all together? Because collectively, we have to work together on achieving their common goals. It's something like what Phyllis was just talking about. And Treasury 3 years ago released the future of financial management with a 10-year vision. That vision looks at where we think financial management should go, and we've established some initiatives and actionable milestones, some quantified measures in order to be able to track progress. And in fact, every year, just a couple of weeks ago, I released our 2020 progress statement. But when you do that, you also have to take a step back and look at the vision from different lenses. And so we did an environmental scan this year, and what I'm showing here are 6 trends that we identified that are affecting definitely the viewpoint of the fiscal service, but all of us. When Dave talked about my background, these are the things that some of them I didn't even think about as a CFO, but I should have been, or things I should definitely be thinking about now. And I wanted to touch on them just a little bit. In terms of the customer experience, so when Phyllis talked about technology and smartphones, that industry has really created the expectation from people of how they want to interact through technology, and the pressure is on government in order to be able to keep up with citizens' expectations for how they interact with either the government or the way they're used to interacting in the private sector. So those trends are things that we're looking in terms of the fiscal service and how we can better offer those services that you can use in your agencies. Another one that you don't normally think about, but it's this next category of new entrants and the rise of fintech. And this is even something I was on a JP Morgan alumni call yesterday with Jamie Dimond, and he was even talking about how fintech and these large, big tech companies have influenced the way traditional banking has been operating, and it's influencing the way JP Morgan is looking at it. Well, it's influencing the way we're looking at it too, because when you have these new entrants, we look in the fiscal service about how we can tie into those platforms to provide better digital wallet options for your customers so that they can pay in the way that they're accustomed to paying in the private sector. Now, real-time everything is something that's going to affect us all. That's something, this generation now is like, you want information, you want it now, you don't want to have to wait for it. Well, that's going to affect the way that we close, the way that we do forecasting. It's not going to be, well, I'll get those numbers to you in a week from now. It's like, the expectation is we have a lot of data, we should be able to harness it, and we should be able to do forecasting on the fly. In terms of data and predictive analytics, that's another thing where we've been doing a lot of thought in terms of how we do data analytics. And I appointed the first chief data officer in the Bureau to look at not only how are we displaying government-wide data, but also how are we harnessing the data that we're already getting from all of you in terms of government finances and turning that into actionable information like statistics on the homeless reduction, and when you have the financial component with the performance component, disaster preparedness and the things that we do, we have to continue to think how we do that better. And then the last two are more about workforce and workplace, which is something that Phyllis also touched on, and things that we're looking at. The workforce of the future is about talent and not about positions. And a lot of times we think about, what are my FTEs or how many people do I have? But we are also focusing, and the CFO Council has spent a lot of time looking at upskilling and how do we provide training to position our current employees for these future opportunities. And as we all know, in terms of the workplace of the future, the pandemic has proven that we can work remotely when we all thought that would be challenging. It's been challenging, but we've been doing it, I think, across the board very effectively. Well, how is that going to influence the workplace of the future? And these are the things that the Bureau is looking at. And in fact, we're taking these 6 things and we are applying that to how we're organized to look at what services do you want from us, what services can we be providing, how can we add better value and make our data more transparent. And we'll eventually lead in the next year to a reorganization of the Bureau so that we can be better focused on customer experience, on data and innovation wrapped around the umbrella of the workforce. So with that, then I'll turn it back to you, Dave, but those were the opening comments that I wanted to make about the influences that are currently facing all the CFO community.
Thank you, Tim. Megan, can you go to the next slide, please? Lynn, the Department of Agriculture certainly plays a key role in our economy, and certainly during the pandemic, you've been asked to take on some incredibly important tasks in support of folks that are really in need. And one of the things that I learned when I was working with you, when I was at OMB, was just how complex and unique all of the different components within your department are. And one of the challenges that I think a departmental CFO has is, how do I manage across such diversity of the different missions of your components? And I know you've been doing work around, how should the components actually move to this new modernized environment? Can you talk a little bit about some of the things that you've been spearheading and some of the accomplishments and some of the challenges that you've faced?
Well, where do I start? Thanks for the question, Dave. So, if you don't know, right, so we, USDA, as Dave kind of alluded to, it is a major, cabinet level complex, organization, over 100,000 employees. We have 29, agencies and staff offices, and those break down into further, mission areas, where we have actual individual kind of missionary CFOs at that level. And, and those CFOs, communicate with myself and the CFO of the department to make sure, from a department-wide perspective that, we're doing what's necessary in terms of policies, statements, audits, everything that kind of fits into the shell of what the CFO office does. But, as we were, and, I'm looking at the title, reinventing, right? Reinventing the CFO role. And, we've been looking at, things that are coming down the pike. One, the Vision Act, the CFO Vision Act. And we know that that's still kind of in progress, but we were kind of looking at what would that look like, in USDA. What things do we need to maybe start kind of doing preliminarily to kind of get ready for a model such as that. So, this slide that you see up now, really just gives, from a high level perspective, just some of the things that, we just tried to start unpeeling, and what do we look at? And I heard, Phyllis say, collaboration. And that's one of the things that we're trying to, do more of, collaboration between the financial and accounting people, and the budget, data, looking at that data, and then also tying it to the program or the programmatic data. And, that can be a challenge in itself because of these three lanes that we see here. So the first one, we're looking at what type of information are these executives looking for? If you're talking about an undersecretary or an administrator, in one of these mission areas, what are they looking for? So one thing we start looking at is the data. Isn't it? What is the data? And the data is going to inform us, about the opportunities and the vulnerabilities, So we're looking at the data. We're trying to, put it in a format where, again, it's understandable. So we're looking at the strategy, review, what we've done in the past. What have, executives asked for in the past? And, what do we need to do to kind of maybe shift or evolve what we're doing to make sure that we're meeting their needs going forward? And part of that is that second lane, which is the reports. So reporting is a big part of, getting data out, being able to do decision making. And so we're looking at, we're asking the questions now, like, okay, what information do you need? What decisions do you need to make? And then, if you're getting information now, if it's not the information you need, what do you need? Do we have to refine existing reports to get you the information you need? Do we need to create new reports to get the information you need? And so we're asking those type of questions as well. And then in that final kind of column there, when we talk about the terminology, it's probably no surprise that accountants talk differently than budget people, who talk differently than the data officer, who talks differently than, the program person. So somehow we're going to have to, get a standard kind of nomenclature where we're bridging the gap to what is it that we really need to make decisions around. And, we're trying to be really strategic about this because we find that we have kind of, somehow fit ourselves into this kind of number crunching box, right? Or report compliance box, right? So we know we got to do the Data Act. We know we got to do audits. We know we have to do improper payments. And we're checking all these boxes, but we want to not only be the number cruncher, and that's why we have that at the bottom. We want to shift from just being just the number cruncher and report compliance officer to being a strategic advisor that's, again, giving those end users, those stakeholders, the information that they need to make decisions. And so, it's just, again, in the preliminary stages of what does that look like? Can we, start with one of the smaller offices and see if we can kind of, again, proof this out and then be able to make, build it up to a more of a department level. But we absolutely see that there is a shift, in the CFO role, again, as we read the Vision Act, and we're trying to, in some sense, kind of position ourselves to be able to adapt and align with that.
Thank you, Lynn. Megan, can you move to the next slide, please? Zach, Senator Warner was one of the sponsors of last year's CFO Vision Act, and I think many of us who read it saw it as sort of the logical progression from the CFO Act of 1990, and certainly embraced some of the recommendations in the report that Phyllis was involved in. And how do we move federal financial management to that next level? Could you talk a little bit about the history, the background, and some of the key points of the Vision Act?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you to Dave for moderating this conversation today, and for everyone else who's on the panel here, for what I think is a really important conversation about what is the role of the CFO, what is the future look like in terms of federal financial management, and how do we improve upon the lessons that we've learned over time here. As Dave said, I'm a part of Senator Warner's team that is working on government performance issues, good government policy, looking at ways that we can form smart, data-driven, and bipartisan solutions to issues that we're facing. With that being said, in that context, this is a really exciting issue that Senator Warner came to and is very passionate about. We've talked some already about the importance of this milestone law and what the CFO Act meant for the government and meant for how agencies conduct financial management. It's also enabled Congress to do a lot, and Congress has taken a lot of interest in the progress that's been made over time, and also a lot of the oversight and strategic decision making that we are able to do in Congress, because we have and agencies have these additional tools. As the law has been in effect for the past 30 years, during that time, Congress has looked for ways to build upon its efforts, make improvements. Add to it, Lynn mentioned some of those efforts, like the Data Act, ways that we can improve the way that we conduct financial management. We've also learned a lot of lessons across those 3 decades in terms of financial management, in terms of what works, in terms of what doesn't work as well as we would hope it to work. In the 30-year anniversary that we had this past year for the CFO Act, really gave Congress and gave a lot of folks a really good opportunity to kind of pause and take stock of where things stood with the law. Phyllis mentioned, I think the really valuable and comprehensive report that GAO had put together. There were a whole bunch of other groups that similarly kind of took a 30-year comprehensive look at the law and at our federal financial management practices, to see, looking at just how far we've come, which is a really far way, looking at the ways that financial management has improved over time, and then ways that we can improve upon it going forward. Senator Warner came to this issue, wanting to take stock of the progress that we've made, and see how we can work with experts and work with stakeholders to make some of those identified improvements that folks have talked about. Senator Warner and Senator Enzi, who has since retired, teamed up last Congress to put together a bipartisan package of reforms and improvements, a number of which are outlined here on this slide, in a package that we referred to as the CFO Vision Act of 2020 that looked to capitalize on a lot of these improvements and kind of solidify a lot of the gains that we've made and keep building on that front. A lot of them, and I'm excited to dive into some of these in more detail and have a conversation about these. A lot of them can be viewed in the frame, I think, of empowering CFOs and empowering financial management professionals. Tim had talked about better utilizing data for strategic decision making. Lynn had talked about kind of going forward what the role of the CFO is in terms of a strategic decision maker, as opposed to how some agencies could view the role. A lot of these reforms and improvements that we've put forward are through that lens of, how can we take advantage of the financial management talent that we have? How can we make improvements to the workforce? How can we make improvements to some of the requirements that exist under the CFO Act, build upon some of the things that we've seen over the years, and capitalize on a lot of those gains. With the way Congress works, we were able to get the bill past the Senate this past Congress. Because we're now in a new Congress, you kind of have to start from a new place, get it introduced, remove it down the pipe. But I know that Senator Warner and a lot of other bipartisan partners up here in Congress are eager to put together in advance, work in a really collaborative way with stakeholders and experts and partners like you all on ways that we can continue to improve upon this and continue to see gains with how we handle financial management. And so I'm excited for the rest of the back and forth in this conversation and kind of diving into some of those points in detail, because I think this is a really important issue that a lot of folks on the Hill are interested in working with you all in a really collaborative and bipartisan way.
Thank you, Zach. I'm going to actually, we've gotten some very good questions from the audience, but I want to sort of say that two things on this particular slide, Zach, that I'd like to get into a little bit of conversation with the rest of the panelists. One was around this requirement for the preparation of a 4-year annual financial management plan. And I'd be very interested in sort of the thought process. And I know, Phyllis, one of the recommendations that came out of your study also talked about this need for more comprehensive financial management planning from the community perspective of, what are the investments I need to make in technology? What are the investments that I need to make in human capital? Can you, Phyllis and Zach, talk a little bit about why this became important, both in the GAO report, but also in the Vision Act? And then I'd like to pivot to Tim and Lynn and sort of get your perspective on the value you see in developing that 4-year plan on an annual basis.
Okay, I certainly can start. I think when we looked at the historical data, even from 1987, what was apparent was the lack of centralized strategic leadership and vision for how to go forward. So back during 87, there were no financial statements anywhere in the federal government. And there was a very decentralized structure. So the CFO Act came up with this requirement for a 5-year plan. So that 5-year plan was supposed to be done annually, and it was supposed to contain information in the plan. For example, What's the strategy going forward for financial management systems? How does the federal government get to clean audits? How does the federal government ensure that the financial management personnel needs are being met? Proposals for eliminating duplicate financial management systems. So there were some key requirements that were in that CFO Act. And it was really interesting because when we looked at those plans from 1991, they were very, very detailed. Some of them were 50 to 70 pages long. You saw a lot of goal setting, and every year there was an assessment. And so you saw all the players in the federal government coming together with a unified vision that had very different points, but still was comprehensive and it was unified. And each year there was progress assessed, there was progress made, there were changes in direction. But once you see the story from the details and the involvement, the key involvement of agencies, Treasury, OMB, the CFO Council, I mean, people really got into it with their hands, got their hands dirty for the most part, and had these plans, and a tremendous amount of progress was made. Now, there had to be different assessments, there had to be different changes, modifications, and adjustments, but that plan was central, and it was done up until 2009. But that was really the vehicle that brought everybody in the federal government, as far as financial management, together. Now, the goal for financial management is just not to have financial management. The goal is to produce information that decision makers, including Congress, can use. And one of the things that was really important with the CFO Act was costs. How much is government costing? How do you manage the cost of government? And so financial management system and structures and reports and planning and audits, it's all towards the issue of having reliable data in order to manage the cost of government and manage that cost in light of performance. So when we looked at all those CFO 5-year plans, I mean, they were great. It was a good vehicle. They were not done after 2009. But they were in different places. So it was in the president's management agenda. Some of it was the management discussion analysis and the consolidated financial statements. So the documents were different places. But the financial management plan provided more of a long-term vision for where to go, how to get there, and how much would it cost in order to get there.
Thanks, Phyllis. Zach, from the perspective of the Vision Act, you picked up that as a requirement as well. Can you give some insight into, from your members' perspective, regardless of the committees that he's sitting on, how do you think the House, the Senate would be able to utilize this kind of plan?
Yeah, I think Phyllis gave kind of great context and great background into kind of what led to some of the thinking there, and how our work was very much informed, like I said at the top, from the work that GAO did, from work that other experts in this field did. And so with regard to the strategic plan, this was something we really wanted to take a good look at. So improving the government-wide plan was important to us, in requiring government-wide planning is important to us because for a couple reasons: allowing agencies and allowing the government as a whole to have kind of a strategic vision, long-term goals that they want to accomplish in terms of financial management that span agencies. Having a plan is important so that agencies and their financial decision makers can work towards those long-term goals and be strategic planners against that top line progress that the government's looking to make. And Dave, to your question specifically about Congress, this is, I think, a really important component for us because, one of our roles obviously being conducting oversight and ensuring accountability for taxpayers and the money that the government is spending, how we're utilizing taxpayer money. I think having clear, defined government-wide plans that everyone can see and kind of compare against, being able to measure progress against plans, being able to have a shared understanding of what we're trying to accomplish, the strategic decision making that needs to be made to get to those goals, and allowing Congress to just have insight into what agencies are trying to do to improve upon our financial management practices is something that's a really valuable tool for us, and is something that we felt was an important component to this bill and to this effort.
Thanks, Tim, in the slide that you had up when you were talking about the sort of the trends in the environment, both the customer focused as well as the employee focused trends, how do you see this 4-year plan as assisting or not assisting in sort of moving your organization forward?
I see it as assisting, as long as my definition of what you mean is the same. And that is, and I'll give you two contexts. One is from my experience at SBA, as well as what I'm doing at the Bureau now. And that is, in the CFO's organization at SBA, we had a 4-year plan that was for the Office of the CFO that tied into the agency strategic plan. But it outlined what we wanted to do over a 4-year period in relation to financial management, performance management, data, systems, and the workforce. And everything that we did with annual planning was based on that. So now fast forward at the Bureau, it's the same thing. So we just went through this past year a refresh of the strategic plan for the Bureau, which is a financial management organization, which dictates everything that we want to do around our priorities. So we have a strategic plan that provides more clarity on strategies and measures that we'll use to determine whether we're achieving those strategies. Our priorities, so we established 7 overriding priorities that everything maps to. And then on top of that, we then use that as part of our decision-making process on governance, because we have a 5-year capital investment plan, as well as it ties down into our IT strategic plan, so that everything is linked from where we want to go with data, workforce, innovation, the customer experience, and improved financial reporting, all tied together in this same plan, so that it can communicate it to employees, so that if there's a tie-in between the organizational goals and the personal performance plans, and have the organization aligned towards the common goal. Now, this plan also ties up into the Treasury strategic plan. So if we're talking about it from that perspective, I am all for it. I don't, personally, I haven't seen some of those earlier ones, but a 50 to 70 page plan is too much to me. It's hard to communicate that. I believe in being really concise into what your plans are, and then having the follow-on processes with what are the priorities, what are the enterprise activities that are going to use to achieve the goals that are articulated in a 4-year plan.
So Tim, since the Bureau, is in the position of providing centralized services to, a vast majority of the CFO Act agencies, as well as, shared services, and this is why I want to pivot over to Lynn, it would be critical for you and Lynn to both know what your 4-year plans should look like, so that it actually syncs up, right? And Lynn, I'd ask you to sort of talk a little bit about, how you view this, proposed requirement of a 4-year plan, both, from the department level, but also, since Tim provides support to you, how those sort of sync up together.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head about we need to be able to be in sync, right? Because as Tim mentioned, we also do an internal plan that links up to our departmental strategic plan, their goals that and objectives, and we match those up. And when we're talking about this financial management plan, we do plan, and we have a shared service type platform. So we have to plan out. We're looking at things we have to do in terms of enhancement, in terms of mandates and things of that nature. And I think the one thing that I would be, I don't want to say concerned, but I would want to make sure is that there is, some clarity around what are the defined metrics or, what need to be in this plan, because what I would not want to do is have a plan and then have to do a second plan to meet the needs of of the Vision Act. So if there's some way we could kind of on the front end say, okay, this is what we're looking for, and then we as CFOs can take that back and say, okay, we know that we're matching to an overall strategic plan, but we need to have this included in our plan from from the Vision Act perspective as well. So I think there is value in having clear defined metrics where you can do some kind of benchmarking and looking across the government and see how everybody is doing in terms of meeting the objectives and the goals within their plan. But I really just hope that it's not so ambiguous where that everybody's just doing their own template and it's not it's not meeting, I'm sure, the desired end result, which is being able to use it to be able to inform, Congress and the Hill and other, stakeholders of how we're using government money. So I would definitely advocate for a lot of upfront conversations about what the plan looks like and what it includes, and so that we can all kind of be on the same page, and be proactive on them.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. I want to now pivot to a couple of.
Dave, can I just follow up to that real quick? I think those are great points, and I think to what Lynn said, absolutely, you want to make sure that any plan, any effort that you're putting forth is useful and usable, whether it's to Congress, whether it's to agencies. Like I said, in terms of empowering financial management professionals to be these strategic decision makers, want to make sure that we're, and this is how, Senator Warner and our team and Senator Enzi's team had wanted to approach the bill last Congress, and definitely how, we see the relationship going forward. Want to make sure that there's, a ton of conversation and engagement on this with CFOs, with relevant councils, with financial management professionals here, so that everyone's on the same page in terms of what we're looking for, why we're looking for it, so that, like Lynn said, there is use for this, and there's utility gain from all of these different things that we're talking about here.
Right, and I would just like to add that, so the requirements of the plan are pretty broad, and they are in the CFO Act. And so the plan is targeted to, say, OMB, and each CFO Act agency is to put the same requirements. So if there are, say, 10 different requirements, for example, milestones for equipment acquisitions, or how do you plan to meet your financing, your personnel plant needs. So it's all crafted in the CFO Act, and it's mirrored in the CFO Vision Act. One of the key things is that before, in the existing CFO Act legislation, it's an annual requirement. So with the Vision Act, it turned it into doing it every 4 years. Because with the maturity of financial management in the government, we certainly felt that there was not a need to do it annually. And with the Government Results and Performance Act, it would coincide with that time frame. Yeah.
Let me pivot now to a couple of questions that have come in from the audience around human capital, and I know, Phyllis, it was in your report. Zach, it's addressed in the CFO Vision Act. Tim, you touched on it. Lynn touched on it in your opening comments. One of the questions that I think we have is how does the community deal with the technology changes that are happening, every single day? And I'll use RPA as an example that, probably in the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen now, many of the CFO Act agencies moving out with the implementation of RPA. And I'd be interested in how you deal with that from the workforce perspective of, how do we move from, the old way of doing business of, spreadsheets and moving Excel, spreadsheets from one computer to another computer to, RPA, which is the beginning of even more technology like machine learning and potentially artificial intelligence. How do we deal with that as a community? What are the things that CFO Act agencies and others need to consider going forward? And I know, Tim, both you and Lynn have, quite a set of experiences around, introducing RPA to your respective organizations. So maybe, Tim, do you want to start, and then Lynn?
Yeah, so we've been looking at it because when we looked at the introduction of RPA, it was with the workforce in mind and how we're enabling you to do your job better, not to replace you, and being able to move to that higher value work. So, but in some cases, it does require a reskilling. If someone's used to just taking a number from one spreadsheet and putting it on another, that they could be doing something that adds more value, like data analytics. So we've been embracing training on a data analytics approach so that when you get the information from the RPA, that you're not spending the time that you used to spend putting it together, you can now spend on figuring out, well, what does it mean, and is the RPA working correctly? Did anything break? So the data quality part of it, and then looking at it also factors into our workforce plans to say that as we introduce more RPA, then we don't necessarily have to hire up as much as the original forecast, because we've reduced some of that manual and turned that manual processes into an automated process. And so it's a multi-factor part of our plan and our strategy going forward, looking at it from training and as well as from the impact on operations.
Thanks, Tim. Lynn?
Yeah, I would again have to echo a lot of things Tim mentioned. First off, RPA and IA in general and all these, types of technology that's been greatly embraced and, in our organization. As Tim mentioned, there is a communication piece to this and ensuring that, that the workforce understands that, again, we're not firing people, we're shifting people to higher value work. And so we've seen, in the organization that there's a great, a lot of people want to learn about RPA. It's a great asset in their mind. They look at it as a way to, develop themselves career-wise. So we haven't had a lot of the, what does this mean for me, or are you going to do something with my job thing? And I think that's a good thing, overall. But I also would say that, in terms of just workforce planning in general, that, right now we are still, I want to say we haven't really dipped yet. We've just kind of shifted. So it's not necessarily cost savings, just it's more of cost avoidance. And we're shifting those people, again, with everything around budgets, and sometimes you can't hire up as like you would like to anyway. So we're using reskilling as a platform to, again, shift people and be able to have them do this higher value work. So, we've definitely been, successful. We've had 2 cohorts around RPA, and, now that it's actually in a CIO shop, but we actually put the initial governance framework in place, and we still are working on financial related bots. So as it relates to RPA across the department. Also, you can use it for other back office things, whether it's IT, HR, procurement, and then programmatic things. So the actual service management office sits in OCIO, but we still do and are developing bots for financial management purposes, and sharing them across our other shared services platforms or business lines. So we definitely see it as a great asset to the organization, and we believe the way we communicated it has helped the employees embrace it as well.
Thank you, Lynn. Tim, you mentioned in your opening comments the establishment of the first ever Chief Data Officer within the Bureau. Could you talk a little bit about how you came to that decision, and because of the unique position that the Bureau has within the government with the aggregation of data, from across the entire government, what do you see from a future perspective you being able to do, for departments, but also for the Congress when you start sort of focusing on this data and the Chief Data Officer's role?
So when I entered the Bureau, I would say from the data function, it was largely focused on the external. So it was focused on USA spending, but it wasn't focused on the other aspects of, having actual data governance and data part of a governance structure to say, as we weren't even looking necessarily within our own systems to say, were we identifying the data standards or the data elements the same way in our different systems, because we have hundreds of systems that we use to do our business. And so by appointing a Chief Data Officer, we were able to take not just the external focus, but the internal focus, put together a data plan, a data governance process, bring the organization together so that we're all speaking with one voice, but then also talking about how can we use the data better. So through that, then we were able to add more value, I think, to USA spending, where we were able to respond to the need to, let's say, track the COVID spending and work with O&B on the way that we would use to track the spending with agencies, updating the guidance in a timely way. I hope, Lynn, you agree with that. I don't know, but then reaching out to the community to say what's even possible, so that we can produce some visualization on USA spending, so that people can track what's happening with the spending. But one of the recent things that was an effort of the Chief Data Officer was, you talk about making data more accessible, and I go back to the early days of open data and publishing high value data assets, and with some minimal success, but that's because I don't think we had the context behind it. And so what we did this past year was create a new data source, fiscaldata.treasury.gov, which provides these high value data assets, the databases that people are interested in, but provides the context behind it. It's not just publishing the data, but it's also publishing what's the metadata behind it. What's the reliability of the data? What are some concerns potentially with it? How can I download it and use it and ingest it into whatever I'm doing, so that I can analyze and make sense of it? It's going down that route, and those are tools that we are implementing on USA spending, with the analysis part of it, tying performance where we can with financial data, and then this fiscal data as a way to have a really structured way of publishing data in a really meaningful way. That's how I would say, but by wrapping it all around the governance process to make sure that we understand when we're asking for data that we're going to be able to use it because we understand what we're asking for, and then working on what are the data standards. So one of the things that we talk about with mixed systems, it's we all have different acquisition systems and HR systems that connect to our financial systems, and we're working with the financial management community on how to standardize the interfaces between those mixed systems so that we can make sense of the data across the federal government in a really useful way. And Lynn, I'll turn it to you.
So we have a chief data officer as well, and you know, so and the whole visualization, like I said, doing the data analytics using open source, open data sources and things of that nature has been a great benefit to the department. And I think I would also use the example of COVID, just data reporting as an example as well. Being able to utilize data and see that across different field offices, different states, and being able to turn that into useful data for decision making, whether it relates to reopening efforts and things of where the needs are. I heard Dave mention early on in this in this panel about the food and things that we serve in terms of food insecurity, making sure that different programs are operating and in place in these different states that are really having great challenges around the pandemic. So the chief data officer is very a critical cog in that whole process. And what I would also say is that from the CFO perspective, and it kind of gets to the point, I think, of what the Vision Act is saying, is that there should be some kind of overarching, making that can't get my words up, operationalized that, where that we don't have the chief data officer doing one thing, we don't have the chief evaluation officer doing one thing, and everybody's kind of working in their silos, and money is being spent maybe 2 and 3 times over because we have a tendency to get contractor support to help us do things, and we need to make sure that we have an overarching kind of role that says, okay, let's get all the requirements together for all these different pieces, and then make sure that it gets done. So we have been making sure that we do stay in contact and kind of in tandem with our chief data officer, because he comes to us for system kind of data, he comes to us for payroll data, he comes to us for all different kind of site data, and then we're actually sharing that with the budget officers. We're sharing that with other, again, interested stakeholders to say, okay, what requirements do you have? What do the auditors want? What do we need for Data Act? What do we need for the Hill? What do so we need to somehow make sure that we have all those requirements, and the CFO kind of doing that integration between all these different kind of CXO type positions, I think is a critical part to make sure that we're doing this in a streamlined and a more efficient way.
Phyllis, one of the underlying tenets of the original CFO Act, really gets to this issue of, the government's responsibility, in this case CFOs, in providing that reliable, relevant, timely data, transparent data, to the Congress and to the public. I guess I'd be interested in both you and Zach's sort of view on, if there is more direction you think that needs to be applied to moving out in this whole area of data management and data transparency, and tying, to Lynn's point, tying the financial data more closely to the performance of the mission programs that all of this funds.
So I can start. I think certainly with this beginning of the CFO Act, it was how to manage the cost of government. Since that time, you've had other legislation, Government Performance and Results Act, the GPRA Modernization Act. So there've been a lot of attempts to try to get at measuring performance. And I think the next step would be for all agencies, because some agencies are able to measure costs. So they have activity-based costing. And so they're a little further along with comparing cost information to performance information, because comparing the two really gets at the solution of, is this program worth the amount of money that's being spent on it? And until you have those two things integrated, it's very difficult to make that determination in an objective manner. Certainly, there's been a lot of movement driving towards that. It's been a number of steps. The government is not there yet as a whole, but I think linking performance with costs may help, I guess, prioritize certain efforts, programs, and initiatives. And so those things can be measured in a more objective manner. So you can say what's working, what's not working, should we put more money here and take some money from over here because things are not working. I think once you have those things together, so I think the next steps would be cost information for all the agencies, getting at that cost information relative to what's really important to the mission, what needs to be measured, and how is that information measured and linked to the costs.
Yeah, I think, I mean, just adding to what Phyllis said, I think that's hugely important in being able to link performance data with spending data with cost data. I think is kind of one of the key promises of, you know, the potential of the original CFO Act for, you know, interested stakeholders, whether it's Congress, whether it's taxpayers, whether it's, you know, advocacy groups, who are looking at this thing, to be able to, you know, discern some measure of, you know, success, or be able to evaluate how agencies are spending money and what is the return that taxpayers and Congress, the American people, are getting for that spending, if you will. And so, you know, finding ways to better promote those linkages, to have, you know, like was talked about earlier, the CFO be kind of this integrator role who is working with these other relevant experts, you know, be in the agency, be it in the C-suite, whether it's the chief data officer, chief evaluation officer, you name it, so that we can get a sense of, you know, kind of what is the bang for our buck that we're getting in terms of, you know, different agency spending in different programs and in different priority areas.
You know, Zach, building on what you just said, you know, one of the questions that came in, talked a little bit, and it goes to, you know, one of the items that was on the slide, and you know, one of the recommendations in the Vision Act was actually broadening the portfolio for, I won't say every existing CFO, but for many CFOs, by, you know, recommending that, and this was in GAO as well, is, you know, should CFOs have responsibility for the budget formulation, for the strategic planning, for the linkage of spend with performance. Can you talk a little bit about the senator's view on that, and why that, you know, why that recommendation, you know, the Senator Warner and Senator Enzi had, and then I'd like, you know, Tim and Lynn and Phyllis to weigh in on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's, you know, like you said, that's definitely something that was raised in GAO's study of this. It was something that we heard time and time again from, you know, other groups who are studying this, from CFOs, from financial management professionals, who, you know, we know it to be the case from those conversations that there can be a wide degree of variance of what a CFO looks like from agency to agency. And, you know, to the extent that you could standardize that role and get more of a uniform understanding of what a CFO is and does at each agency, I think could have a number of positive impacts, you know, again, through the lens of, I think, empowering the, you know, really talented financial management professionals that we have in government, promoting, you know, a better understanding of the work that they do and the expertise that they have, you know, whether it's within their agency, whether it's across agencies, whether it's, you know, at other, whether it's, you know, within Congress looking at the agencies. understanding what they do, what their roles are, being better able to evaluate, therefore, what resources do they need, what progress are they making, having agency leadership, being able to draw upon that expertise and being able to draw upon the wealth of experience that a lot of CFOs do have, so that they can be that strategic decision maker and that strategic planner within their agency. And related to that, one of the things that we were also doing is looking at the role of the deputy CFO, because in addition to the variance in the role of the CFO across agencies, we also heard time and time again about the role that the deputy CFO plays. And in a lot of cases, it can be pretty distinct from the focus and the roles and responsibility that the CFO would have. And in terms of, empowering them to work as a team, but then also addressing the issue of, a lot of times, I think we all know that, there are a lot of cases, a lot of agencies will have an acting CFO for an extended period of time, and making sure that the folks who are in those deputy roles, have the, can more easily fill into that spot and more easily, provide steady, continued leadership for an agency in cases where there is an acting in that role. I think is something that's really important. And I think those are two of the ways that we were trying to get at, defining that role and trying to get at empowering the people who are in those roles within their agencies.
Lynn, and then Tim, maybe, your perspective, because you've both sat in those positions.
Yeah, so, I'm going to start with how Phyllis started. A disclaimer, this is my this is my opinion. It does not represent maybe necessarily the opinions of the department as a whole. But I do agree with, the direction that the Vision Act takes the CFO. As was mentioned, there's not only variation, sometimes across federal agencies, but sometimes even within federal agencies. So we have, as I mentioned, a pretty large, complex organization, and we have not only departmental CFO and deputy, but then we have mission area CFOs. And so to have some type of standardization in terms of what they are responsible for, I think, goes a long way in the organization. So, a lot of things that are mentioned here, we do have some of that in USDA under the CFO, but not all of it. And so, I think, when we look at how things overlap, being that strategic, again, advisor, at the table, I think is incumbent upon that position to kind of have a broad view across the organization, including the performance and, again, some of the other things that are mentioned here. So I believe the direction that this goes in makes sense to me. And that standardization that it brings, I think, would be helpful across government. That no matter what agency you are in, this is your role, and so I believe that would go a long way.
Yeah, and I would say, and it's so Lynn's word is the strategic advisor part of it. And at SBA, I had all of the things on this list except for risk management, although by the time I left, I was deputy chair of the Enterprise Risk Management Committee. And the one thing I also had on this list that's not on this list is acquisition. And when it tied all together, especially when you tie in planning, the performance, the budget, and financial management, being able to report everything, then you really do become that strategic advisor because you understand how everything interacts with the program offices. Mm-hmm. So I felt I was better able to advocate for SBA when we were presenting our budget to the Hill. One thing that, and I'll part with a comment that Linda McMahon, who was the administrator, the office administrator under the Trump administration, said to me is that, you know, she was the CEO of a multi-international, multi-billion-dollar corporation. And she said, you know, every time I meet with you, I think back to how this is so different than when I met with my CFO at the WWE. She said, because he focused on certain things like what's happening with the stock market, what's happening with the capital markets, what's the impact on our financial statements. And she said, you're that, but everything else too, because you can provide me advice on resource planning, on how something might work within the agency, because I worked with the Chico in terms of FTE resources. And I was on a lot of the governance councils in the agency, because you have a broad perspective. The financial management part of it is one piece of it. When you add the others, it really is an unbeatable combination to be able to drive change within an agency.
Thanks, Tim. So I promised everybody that we would be on time, and it's still sunny, the sky is still blue, and it's still 60 degrees. So we're down to literally 2 minutes. We have a ton more questions. We probably could have stayed here for another couple of hours, but I want to thank the panelists for this afternoon's contribution. I think the discussion around where we're going as a community and what some of the challenges are, and some of the, you know, creative things that are already underway was really important for our audience to hear. And I asked the audience to extend their thanks and appreciation, Phyllis and Lynn and Tim and Zach, for your time this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.